There are some people out there that are so good at what they do, so renowned at their craft, that only one name is required. Mozart, Jordan, Ronaldo, Brady, Scorsese, Sinatra. And some just by their first name even. Michelangelo, Oprah, Tiger, Zlatan. And then there's a group that's in a class all of their own. Mere mention of any part of their name would conjure up the vast contributions that they have to their respective fields. Which brings us to the topic of today's video. Enzo Ferrari. The legacy of the legendary Italian auto manufacturer is so ingrained in Formula One whether people want to admit it or not, and for good reason. The only manufacturer to compete in every single Formula One championship, 15 drivers' championships, 16 constructors, Ferrari is a powerhouse. And if you were new to Formula One in, say, 2020, you'd never guess that. But how did we go from this to this?
Okay, it was all I had, so I've tried. Thank you. Understood? Thanks.
It's no secret that Ferrari is showing poor form this year, but how bad could it be, really? Well, you're in luck. In this video, we're going to be delving deep into the history of Ferrari to truly understand the gravity of this season. Stick around until the end. I'll give you my ultimate conclusion as to why I think this is happening and how it can be changed. But wait, let's make this interesting. Comment down below your guess on where this 2020 season ranks in terms of worst Ferrari seasons in the history of the team. And let's see how you do. But don't worry, this isn't going to be all negative. The general theme that will emerge will give us the silver lining. Alright, so back to it. Truly, how bad is it? I mean, if you really wanted to get a feel for this, I guess you could go through the history of the championship. You'd have to pull Ferrari points by every single season. You'd have to cross-reference them by points the winner had, then calculate the gap by percent change to account for the points changes over time. Then you'd have to plot them all individually. It would take literally forever. But I mean, that on-screen graphic would be pretty informative and helpful. Probably learn a ton. But, no way. Nope. Not doing it. Nope, not doing it. Who would just sit around and has the time to pull all of this? So here's a chart plotting the percent change of Ferrari points for every single season compared to the eventual winning constructor. I mean, you know me. I could talk stats and motorsport history all day long. But to keep this concise, interesting, to the point, and topical, let's do the top 5. And let's start right about here. Of the top 5 worst Ferrari seasons, the 1993 season is the best place to start. With 28 points in 4th position. It doesn't really sound like such a bad year on its face, but this was in the era of the Williams domination. Otherworldly, I know. This isn't an alternate universe. But when Williams was winning, they won big. And more evidence of this presents itself with an adjacent season to this 1993 entry, gracing this top 5 worst list. Williams would be a whopping 140 points ahead of Ferrari in 1993, or 500%. And you'll probably notice that I use percent change to actually justify this top 5 list rather than just raw points. And that's due to the fact that this analysis spans different eras, so the point system has changed over time. And using percent change does account for the different points allocation by constructor position. So just want to answer that one right off the bat so you don't have to ask in the comments. And back to the magic. And it wasn't just that Williams was the class of the field. I mean, it's true, but Ferrari was another world away from even the closest competitors in the Braun and Byrne designed B193, driven by a young Michael Schumacher, paired with Riccardo Patrese. The design for that year, the F93A, is probably a car they'd like to drive half as good as it looked. The pairing of Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger may not have been earth-shatteringly quick, but the duo certainly had more pace than that car allowed. Alesi would even produce a P2 in front of the Tifosi in round 13. But that runner-up would only continue the winless drought the Scuderia were currently enduring. Ferrari hadn't found themselves on the top step of the podium since round 14 in Spain of the 1990 season, and this painful streak would persist for 1,400 days, only broken by Berger in the 1994 season at the German Grand Prix. On the technical front, the team would pursue the use of electronic aids more seriously, but it wouldn't really last that long. The 1984 regulation changes were significant. They hit hard against such additions to the car, but nonetheless, active suspension was greenlit for the 1993 season. It was added with the responsibility of manipulating the underside of the car. The front and rear suspensions were comprised of electronically controlled independent actuators. And if the car was finishing races, it was more or less classified in the top 10. And on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, how can you blame Ferrari? This was the absolute pinnacle, the height of electronic aids. Ferrari are having to compete with cars like the FW15C, which is easily the most sophisticated and unrestricted car we've seen on the grid. They'd also lose out to a McLaren car that lost a Honda engine, but clearly the chassis was worth something. Even in that first season powered by Ford, they still had a pretty good package. The writing was on the wall though. Benetton was doing some experimenting of their own. Driven by some very strong technical minds, they captured 11 podiums that year. Overall, those aren't the worst cars to lose to, and it's not even the fact that they lost, it's just how far off they were. But a recurring theme would emerge. The struggle would yield one of the best moves Ferrari made during the 90s, which was to have Jean Todt take over the GES race division as director. Little did they know, Ferrari was just a handful of seasons, one regulatory overhaul, and a couple puzzle pieces shy of unlocking one of the most dominant spells in the history of the sport. Let's take a look at a season with more nuance on and off the track, shall we? A great example of this was the nightmare season Ferrari had in 1973. The 1973 season was shrouded in equal parts politics and performance questions, a situation so dire that Enzo was forced to question the viability of the sport. And not like today when we hear that they may leave the sport, but actually this time. The seeds were sown in the 1972 season when Ferrari's sports team would absolutely dominate, taking 10 of 11 wins. The only event Ferrari wouldn't win was also their only absence from the championship, which was Le Mans. And it'll be relevant here soon as to why Enzo should have paid attention to the winner of that race. The success of the sports car team may have started to compensate, at least in Enzo's mind, for the stale results on the F1 grid. After failing to improve on their 33-point effort from 1971, the 72 campaign saw a further slip from the top, with Jackie Ickx earning the team's only win in Germany. This would come just 1 week after he and Mario Andretti would claim victory at the Watkins Glen 6 Hours in the final event of the World Sports Car Championship. Given there was still half a season to go on the Formula 1 schedule, by the time the sports car season wrapped, the team had to refocus to put in good results. But now, Enzo had another obligation, and that was to keep the FIAT board happy. The injection of cash from FIAT was surely flowing, but it was mostly on the sports car side. And that 1972 sports car season saw Ferrari planning to have 3 cars at each race. But questions began to emerge. Is Ferrari favoring the side of the aisle where they know they can win? Former Ferrari champion John Surtees was quoted as once saying, "At Ferrari, in those days, you started with a handicap. Until Le Mans was over, you couldn't really do the work you wanted to do, and needed to do, in Formula 1. When questions came up about the broader organization's growth, Enzo would highlight the success of the sports car team. Meanwhile, FIAT would reciprocate the gesture by pointing the finger at the F1 team's stagnating results on track. But what FIAT clearly understood well was that the old adage, win Sunday, sell Monday, was very true in terms of dollars and cents. But what they also were self-aware enough to accept was that for Ferrari as a brand, this was mainly driven by the Formula 1 success and less so the sports car team.
When it comes to cars, you can't fool a Ferrari.
Therein lies the problem. There was a fiduciary obligation to push Enzo to find results, but on the F1 grid. And don't forget, this was while Ferrari was the class of the field in sports car. Should that subside, it might very well be a catastrophe for Ferrari. Without the smashing success of the sports car team, there's really nothing to hide behind. And in 1973, the nightmares became reality. Remember that seemingly one-off Le Mans victory the Numatra project had produced? Well, that version of the car had all of the kinks worked out and took the 1973 Sports Car Championship by storm, edging out the win over the long-standing dominant Ferrari. Meanwhile, more disappointment was in order for the Scuderia, in a season that was quickly becoming a political minefield. Mauro Foghieri was the first to take the fall as his design for the 73 season. The 312B3 was so awkward looking that the Italian media dubbed it the snowplower due to its radical snowplow looking front nose design. Colombo was brought in to update the 312B3, which ended up being a disaster. Ferrari were getting beat, and badly. So bad in fact, they skipped multiple Grand Prix altogether, including the German Grand Prix. And this was lead driver Jackie Ickx's favorite race. And it just so happens it's the same race he won just 1 year ago when he was also wrapping up the Sports Car Championship Ferrari a week later at Watkins Glen. It's actually crazy to think how things can change in just 1 year's time. Enzo would be at a crossroads. For the sake of Ferrari, he had to either focus on sports cars or Formula 1. A divided house was no longer a viable option. The pain of that 1973 season would be made better upon the arrival of Luca de Montezemolo. Just 26 years old at the time, Enzo entrusted the sporting director role to the young Italian who had reportedly convinced him to put his faith in the Formula 1 team, and it's a good thing he did. Montezemolo then backed the ousted Foghieri's design of the 312B3. Design and designer would return for the 1974 season, which saw a fresh start in the drivers of Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni. The pair would prove to be a powerhouse, returning the team to P2 in 1974 on 3 wins and 3 straight Formula One constructors thereafter. So while this season shows us a glimpse of a Ferrari ready to prance again, let's return to Ferrari's plummet towards the bottom of the grid in the early 90s. And the scene is the 1992 season. The start of the decade were dark times for the Scuderia, and understandably so. Losing a titan of industry in Enzo Ferrari in 1988 surely shook the team up. Ferrari's shift towards a more bureaucratic structure in the early 1990s made it nearly impossible to innovate forward. That season was directly in the middle of a 58-race drought where Ferrari were absent from the top step of the podium. And I would imagine that Ferrari would accept a pole position as consolation, but even that evaded them, along with the front row entirely in 92. In an effort to establish some semblance of stability, Montezemolo was announced as president in November that year prior, and was adamant about putting Ferrari back on top. His early moves only seemed to be consistent with this. He'd bring back Niki Lauda as external consultant to help push the team forward, and the team would also push forward with a brand new design for the 1992 campaign. But further technical instability plagued Ferrari's ascent to top car as Steve Nichols would leave in December of 1991 to help Peter Sauber make his debut into Formula One, a move that would have grave repercussions on the chassis development and performance throughout that season. This technical instability, chasing innovation instead of directly developing it organically in-house, had a hand in the fluctuations in performance, as well as the lack of carryover of institutional knowledge. This would again be proven true, as new designer Jean-Claude Migeot would have his input on the F92. He was coming off an impressive stint at Tyrrell, revolutionizing front nose aerodynamics, a shift in thinking that would reverberate throughout the sport. His ideas gave way to a radical new double-floor design for the 1992 car, which was heavily inspired by his original training as a qualified aeronautical engineer. The car's oval side pod intakes were a gamble, but wind tunnel data showed improvements. The problem is, integration with the engine is critical, and given how disjointed Ferrari was, or at least appeared to be at the time, hooking up all the components was near impossible, and the F92 was a near miss. In the age of highly innovative cars, Ferrari made attempts at matching the newly designed 14B, which was setting the pace for Williams as Mansell won 80% of the first Grand Prix. He'd also be the first driver in history to win 9 Grand Prix events. But I mean, just look at it. Optically speaking, more fighter jet than car, the F92A would actually be capable of producing the downforce levels needed to challenge. But as it turns out, the V12 may have been the headwind for Ferrari. The more the pacesetters were disappearing from Ferrari's view, the more they clamped down on those speaking out against the engine. And we have some very well documented cases of this. Frustrated by his car's lack of competitiveness, Alain Prost's public criticism of the car led to his dismissal and being paid not to compete for the team in 1992. He'd had the final laugh though, winning for Williams on his swan song in 1993, moving over for Ayrton to take the drive in 1994. And in 1993, Migeot would be shown the door in similar fashion. Despite the cars having a very unique aerodynamic package, Migeot was adamant it wasn't the problem of the new floor. He'd go on record to clear the air by stating the following. The car was very innovative, with a new V12 and new chassis, but the problems were mechanical due to the lack of engine power caused by the blow-by. Given the fact that criticizing the engine could cost you your job, it's really no surprise that Ferrari were unable to keep up with the top of the grid. Thus, it would take until the end of the century and changing of the regulations for Ferrari to finally get things right to bring the title back to Maranello. The revolution began upon the arrival of the Dream Team. And if you want to know more about that story, check the eye in the top right corner of the screen, or to go straight to the story after this video, reference the link in the description. The 63% DNF rate from the 1992 season would limit Ferrari's chance to any notable results for the pairing of John Alesi and Ivan Capelli, the latter replaced by Nicola Larini in the final 2 rounds. The best results would come from Alesi and his 2 podiums in Spain and Canada, as the team was only able to produce 8 in the points finishes on aggregate. Capelli would later describe that F92A drive as the worst car he had ever gotten in his entire career. Let's take a look at what I've deemed the second worst Ferrari season in history, which took place over the forgettable 1969 season. A season that consisted of a total of 7 points. 7 total. And it wasn't as if the drivers weren't capable. Pedro Rodriguez and Chris Amon were considered 2 of the best journeymen to never win a title. The former especially, given his tenure on the grid and record despite changing cars and regulations. As for Pedro, well, he was incredibly versatile and a proven race winner in many categories, including F1. It ran in the family as he and his brother were Ferrari stalwarts. Ricardo was the youngest driver in the history of the sport to start on the front row, holding that record until Verstappen would come along. So all that said, if it wasn't the drivers, what was it? For one, scoring rules dictated that only one car's results would be counted towards the manufacturer's cup. While that Ferrari pairing that season were more than capable of securing the results, most of the teams had 2 cars at any given Grand Prix at least. Should one car retire, the other can hopefully deliver the team's results. But at that time, Ferrari only had the drivers overlapping duties at Silverstone. Pedro would relieve Ammon for the remainder of the season, but even at that British Grand Prix where both cars were there to drive, they'd experienced a double mechanical failure. And more importantly, the $11 million FIAT deal, the one that saw Enzo split his road car division in half while still remaining the slight majority key stakeholder, that took shape in the summer of '68 and officially was announced just ahead of the 1969 season. Ferrari would feel the impact immediately of Fiat's investment, but the sports car dominance came at a cost, and that cost was Formula One. The team would spend 1969 restructuring, and as such, Ammon would use an older spec package, finishing just one of his 6 races he was contracted with for Ferrari. Pedro's stint with the team really wouldn't go that much better. He and his 312 started 5 Grand Prix, retiring twice while making 3 top 10 finishes for a total of 3 points. They would match their worst placement since the Team Cup began, finishing the season P6 for just the second time in a dozen years. The ultimate winner that season, Matro, would have an 843% points advantage on Ferrari. Following the cancellation of the prototype program in 1968, Enzo had to watch the Ford GT40 take Le Mans wins in 4 straight seasons, and the unwinding of his road car business. But a newfound spirit was ignited at Ferrari, given the team's now very cash flow positive financials thanks to Fiat. It's yet another season where the optics aren't pretty, but lift the hood and the story reveals crucial bits. While the path would be slow, the resurgence was on the horizon, as was normally the case with the Maranello outfit. As the saying goes, the night is darkest before dawn, and consistent with this theme is our final season left to discuss, which saw Ferrari in the midst of a very, very long night. A season so bad, you're going to be fact-checking nearly everything I say because it doesn't even seem real. The year is 1980. Ferrari scored more points in 1979 than the total number of days it would take for them to transform into backmarkers. Let that sink in. They would also score fewer points in the 1980 season than their final position in the Constructors' Championship. That's real. That's a thing that actually happened. Over the years in F1, we see teams ebb and flow. It's very difficult to maintain supremacy for any long stint if you're caught up in a change in regulations. We've seen teams go from talk dog to off the pace. Williams in the 80s and 90s had a knack for doing this, but mostly due to Frank losing engine deals and forced to run on inferior engines. For example, their 585% plummet in points going from Honda to Judd in 1988. But it's rare to see a team powered by the same engine, driven by the same drivers, go from champions to backmarkers in the span of exactly 97 days. A season where the high point was a few P5 finishes. No wins, no poles, no fastest laps, no front row starts. With just 8 points to show for it, the defending champs had a Maranello good enough for P10 in the Constructors' Championship, and a 1,400% deficit to the eventual winners at Williams. The season had some positives though. It gave us 2 future world champions in Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell. And they both would drive for Ferrari even. Oof, okay, yeah, maybe not so good given they both left Ferrari by 91, only to win consecutive world titles for another team in 92 and 93. Okay, yeah, that's a little awkward. The team opted for evolution over revolution. Having withstood fairly well the initial landing of the ground effects cars, their 312T continued to power the car in 1980. After all, the engine series is still considered the most effective in F1 history, or at least one of. The wide 312T5 boxer quote-unquote styled engine powered the car, but the flat 12 design was pretty lousy for ground effects due to the low center of gravity and the cylinder heads blocking the formation of venturi tunnels underneath the car. The DFV engine killed off the flat 12, and Ferrari had to learn that the hard way in 1980. But let's put it into perspective how far behind the ground effects ball Ferrari found themselves in 1980. There were 11 teams that scored at least 1 point that season. Only 3 of them weren't powered by Ford Cosworth DFV. Renault was one of those teams, but they already had a V6 turbo under the hood and would score 38 points for a P4. The other 2 were Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, sporting a flat 12 engine, finishing 10th and 11th respectively. This led to Ferrari finishing a record low in basically all categories. Reigning world champion Jody Scheckter would finish in the points on one lone occasion, P5 in Long Beach. He'd also failed to qualify for the Canadian Grand Prix. And while his Canadian teammate Gilles Villeneuve would make an appearance at his home race, he'd only managed to squeeze 6 points out of the car with 7 top 8 finishes compared to Scheckter's 3 top 8. But as Ferrari has proved time and time again, terrible seasons usually are followed by bright spots. Even seasons as bad as this 1981. Ferrari continued to push their innovation on the turbo engine. They'd have 4 runner-up finishes in the turbo decade, being crowned Constructors' Champions on 2 occasions. Their worst result as a constructor would come in that initial launch of the turbo engine, which was in 1981. But as they adjusted to what the car needed to win, wins followed. Now then, on to 2020. So, how bad is it really? Put simply, Ferrari's 2020 form, as it currently stands, is on pace to be a strong contender for a top 3 spot on their worst seasons list. They sit currently in 6th place ahead of the Red Bull sister squad AlphaTauri and chasing down a Renault team that seems to be improving their package. Ferrari currently are flattered by what appears to be a couple podiums from Leclerc that may not be repeatable. If they maintain this position, it'll be just the 5th time that the team has found themselves lower than 5th place in the 1000th Grand Prix and counting history of the illustrious team. And it would be the first time that the team had scored 6th or worse in the past 40 years of competition, with the latest being that dreadful 1980 season we just talked about. Continuing the use of the percent change in points to account for the points system changing over time, the 66 points for the 2020 season has them down 392% from Mercedes' points tally. And based on that metric, this season as it currently stands puts them 6th worst in the history of the team. And to add more nuance to this discussion, in the first 6 rounds of 2020, Ferrari scored 61 points. This accounts for 92% of their points through round 9. Barring any major upgrades, I don't see Leclerc having the tools he needs with this package to chase down Ricciardo. And eventually, I think it's possible that Ocon starts to catch him, possibly even pass him in the Drivers' Championship. Vettel is very obviously the headwind currently to Ferrari's points haul, with Leclerc nearly tripling his total. I don't see him finding any incremental performance as well. So as a team, I expect him to finish right here, P6. I'm even half expecting AlphaTauri to be on their heels come the final rounds of 2020, especially given that Pierre has found a lot of newfound confidence. All that said, I maintain the 2019 power unit controversy was a positive sign for Ferrari fans. Now, hear me out. They found a way to push their innovation while still being gray enough that the FIA couldn't legally call them cheaters. And I can vividly hear your reaction to that. I can understand it. If you scoff at celebrating that concept though, pause the video. Now use this pause time to think. I hereby challenge you to comment below an innovation that pushed a team dramatically forward while still maintaining the same relative power output, and someone didn't call them a cheater. I'll even help out. Here's my list of some of my favorite F1 innovations that just didn't last. And of course, outside of this, there's plenty more. But the common factor to this list is the simple fact that hardly any of them lasted more than a couple races until people caught on. Some of them never at all. But without a change in regulations, Ferrari and the rest of the grid are stuck under strict limitations. You could be saying to yourself, but Nick, it's Ferrari. Just innovate with all that cash and manpower. Well, my fellow fanatical F1 friend, the ceiling to innovate is all but gone. This was a problem I laid out in the Williams video about 6 months ago, mapping out their fall, and why the eventual sale of the team was right around the corner. Check it out after the video, link in the eye in the top right or down in the description. As it relates to the technology of the sport, we're very deep into this innovation process. 40 years ago, cars were developing at a much quicker pace. The variance of what innovation could be produced was pretty wide. But short of a major breakthrough in power or just automobiles period, or even fuel, this era is hamstrung by what's possible from a technical point of view. And it certainly doesn't help that this is one of the longest periods of uninterrupted technical stagnation by the FIA. This 2020 season will wake Ferrari up to the realities of the situation. If they haven't been awoken already, the Scuderia may be down for now. But as we've discussed today, they are not out. There's a reason they've managed to be here since the start of it all. I'll leave you with one of my favorite Sun Tzu Art of War quotes. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. A response is brewing, I have no doubt. So for me, the only question that remains is, what opportunities will Ferrari seize next to return the fabled team back to the top? Only time will tell. For now, we wait. But until then, I've got you covered on interesting F1 content. Subscribe to join the party, and I'll see you very, very soon.
Sunshine and rainbows. I've been feeling good, yeah, you know that it's true. Yeah, that'll work. Sunshine.